everybody. Welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Thursday, May 7th, where we are continuing on with poetry, and believe it or not, next week is the final exam. So today and on Tuesday, we will talk about poetry, and then on Thursday will be the final exam. I'll be posting the final at the time our class would normally meet, which is at 10 a.m. And you have 24 hours in which to respond to that final. Not that you should spend 24 hours on that final, approximately 2 or so, which is what you would be spending in a face-to-face class. And it'll be a series of essay questions that you get choice from, and the bulk of it will be devoted to poetry. That's 80%. And a smaller section, 10% on short story or fiction, and 10% on drama. And you don't know what the questions are, but they are going to be questions that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers. It's more about your argumentation. And you will have choice about what to write about. So depending on the question, that will lead you to make decisions about which text or film, because remember, this is also a film class, to discuss. And next Thursday is the last day that you could hand in any assignments, whether that be paper 2, though I encourage you to hand that in as earlier rather than later, because ultimately, you want to be able to focus on the final examination. And that said, if you've got a revision from paper number 1, that too would be due by Thursday, but basically the time in which the final exam is due is the very last time that you could hand in anything for this particular class. So basically the class is over at that point. So where we are is talking about Emily Dickinson. I selected her as our author to represent the 1800s. Obviously, there are many authors in the 1800s, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste, and I hope that you were able to watch the biography about Emily Dickinson, because Emily Dickinson is not only an esteemed poet, but local as well. And I can't help but talk about Emily Dickinson in the present tense. She's fondly known as Miss Emily, especially in this particular area. And I think that you can see in that documentary that she wrote quite a bit of poetry, and obviously we're not reading it all, but the documentary does give you snippets of her poetry, so you got exposed to a good amount of her writing. But the poem that I had assigned for us for today is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And this particular poem, I think, is one of her easier poems. We know that even the scholars themselves struggle with understanding sometimes what Emily wrote. She wrote for herself. She was never published, or she never intended to be published. And of course, we know that upon her death, her poetry was found by family members, and it was published, and sadly it was edited to correct, quote, mistakes, unquote, as if such a thing is possible, for capitalization and for punctuation usage. So you want to make sure you're reading the correct Emily Dickinson poem, and you can find both forms online and in books. The correct Emily Dickinson poem would have dashes, quite a few of them, in the place of commas. She was very fond of the dash, which is a longer pause, which gives emphasis to what follows afterwards, as opposed to the comma. And she also had irregular capitalization. We usually just capitalize things that are proper nouns, the names of things, in effect. And she didn't necessarily do that. And as the documentary talked about, she oftentimes would use some of the constructs of church hymnals, but she would violate that. She would change that by not necessarily always following the construct of church hymnals, which makes sense when you know that she was a rebel, and also she refused to go to church when it was a pretty big deal to go to church for social reasons, if not for religious reasons. That's not to say that she wasn't spiritual. She's very spiritual. She believed God could be seen in nature, but certainly not religious in the sense of organized religion. And her poetry, I one of the things that I've got listed in the notes below is that it reveals and conceals. And I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about her. She has a wonderful ability to express human emotion in words. And human emotion is difficult to understand, let alone to articulate. It's oftentimes paradoxical and contradictory. And I think we see that in the writing itself. I think that reflects the complexity of human emotion, is that the writing is just as complex as what an emotion could be. Think about something like the woe of ecstasy, these two extremes that can exist at the same time of sadness and happiness. And she oftentimes would talk about the unknowable as if she knew better than anybody, for instance, what death was like or what the afterlife was like. And even though her poetry was personal, very much in the eye, it is also universal, because basically she's talking about what it means to be a human being and all of the feelings involved, or at least many of the feelings involved in all of that. She'd oftentimes talk about death, but wouldn't portray death as a negative. She'd portray it more often than not as a positive. And that's what we will see in the poem I Had Assigned, Because I Could Not Stop Her Death. Some of the many themes that she would talk about would be loss, religion, nature, loneliness, defiance. Over 700 poems. And you can visit her homestead in Amherst. I encourage you to do it. I believe you can get free tickets at most libraries, including the GCC library. And she attended Mount Holyoke, but Mount Holyoke was a very different kind of school at the time. It was a women's seminary to help prepare women for religious worship. And again, while Miss Emily was spiritual, she wasn't at all religious in an orthodox sense. So, Because I Could Not Stop Her Death portrays death positively. It's spoken from the perspective of death, as if Emily Dickinson actually were dead, which is the importance of the ending of the poem. And she says, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The idea that death is presented as kind, because death can present an end of suffering, and death will also provide immortality, which she talks about in her next line. She can't stop for death because we don't control when we die. Death controls when we die, if we are going to personify death in the way that she does. And notice that death is capitalized, and death is usually referred to as a he. So if you think of the Grim Reaper, and you can see how her poem continues in the next stanza, where we've got the journey that they're on together as they're leaving the earthly realm and going into the spiritual. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. And the idea, the concept of time does not exist in the afterlife. You don't need to rush. And I had put away my lever and my leisure too for his civility. So death is called both kind and civil. Labor and leisure, both are human constructs, both unnecessary in the afterlife. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. And there's a long literary tradition of talking about the stages of life represented through a journey. In this instance, it's a carriage journey. And we see the stages through children, in other words, youth. And they're at recess, they're playing in school. In the ring, which is a reference to Ring Around the Rosie, a pocket full of posy, which was not only a game that children would play in the 1800s, I'm not quite sure if they still do today, but it was a game that was in reference to plague. And we passed the fields of gazing grain, and that would be adulthood, the stage we're all at now. And gazing grain would be harvesting, the idea of work, which is what we do as adults. And again, work is unnecessary in the afterlife. And because there is no work, there's no need for leisure or play either. And then we pass the setting sun, which is supposed to be representational of old age. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. And we see movement in this poem where the subject of the poem and death and immortality are all together in a chariot. So there is no idea of dying alone. And as they are leaving the earth, we see them getting closer and closer to the next realm, which is the afterlife. The dews drew quivering and chill, so we see transition here. It's getting colder, it's becoming nighttime. But what we find out, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. And she's wearing very thin fabric. I'm saying she because I'm assuming Miss Emily, but this would apply to any individual on their journey to death. That gossamer is a very thin veil-like fabric, as is tulle, oftentimes used in things like tutus, for instance. Gossamer is oftentimes associated with fairies, for instance. The idea that we wear clothing either for social convention or for protection against the elements, both unnecessary in the afterlife because there is no climate to be concerned about in the afterlife. We pass before a house that's seeing the swelling of the ground. And the word house is capitalized. It could be the house of God. It could be church. Perhaps it's Emily's own house. There is a tradition of funeral processions passing by the home of the deceased before burial. Perhaps it could be a tomb. All apply. The roof was scarcely visible. That's how far away they are from the earthly realm that you could barely see this house. The cornice in the ground. It appears as if the cornice is actually in the ground. It's an architectural element of the roof. And then the last stanza, which ties up everything. Again, a stanza being like a paragraph in many respects. It's a break that you will see in the poetry, and it indicates basically that there's going to probably be a shift in topic. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. So basically, the author of this poem is speaking from the perspective of the afterlife. In other words, this is proof that the afterlife exists because the author of this poem is in the afterlife. This happened centuries ago when death came. And I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Obviously, that's literal. She's in a chariot and it's being pulled by horses. But this is also a biblical reference to the four horsemen of the apocalypse, if you know anything about the book of Revelations. So she will oftentimes use religious allusions as well, which in some ways is rather defiant because she was against the concept of organized religion. So that gives you just a little bit of a taste of Emily Dickinson's writing that we see in this poem transitioning from a limited, finite human world to a spiritual world that's limitless and infinite. Something that really is an improvement, not the fear that oftentimes is associated with death, that it's an ending or that it's something that's negative in some way, or certainly not as positive as life. She presents it in a very different kind of way. There's a comforting element, perhaps, to this poem. And then the next poem I assigned, The Road Not Taken from the 1900s, represents a poem that probably is iconic. And as iconic as Shakespeare's Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And just like Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, perhaps one of the most misunderstood poems on the face of the planet. And we had talked about Shakespeare's sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, how it's oftentimes misread that the poem is written to a woman. There's no gender ever indicated in this poem. And that this is a poem of romance and sexuality. And there's no element of that either in the poem. What we do know from scholars, and that's all we can rely on now, is that this is part of the early set of poems that were written to a young man, probably the Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's patron. And this poem is a poem of flattery, and it makes sense that you would want to flatter your patron. He's providing political, economic support. But the brilliance of the poem is that it is universal enough that it can be used in a lot of different situations, lots of different contexts to a lot of different people. And I can say that The Road Not Taken is another poem that's misread because people forget about the title. Most people know a little bit about The Road Not Taken, and you'll notice that I have included not only a link to The Road Not Taken, but I've actually included the author himself, Robert Frost, reading his own poem. I encourage you to listen to that link. You'll see that his voice is rather raspy and somewhat monotone. Certainly he's reading this in older age. The link I provided for you to actually see the poem online in the Poetry Foundation, which is a wonderful site for finding poetry, is very useful because it oftentimes will provide professional readers reading the poems. You'll see that with a little red arrow, and that's exactly what you see when you click on that. I encourage you to listen to both versions of the poem because it gives a very different tone, much like when we were talking about dramas, where it's not just the language that was written by the author. Much of it is going to be the interpretation of the actor and the vision of the director. So the way this poem is read incorrectly is that many people say that it's about somebody who is confronting a choice, decides to take the less popular choice, and is content with that choice. Nowhere does the poem say that. And the key is in the title, The Road Not Taken. It's not about the choice made. It's about the choice not made, and about the regret and the longing that can occur about the choice not made. Again, we have this idea that life is a journey, and I direct you to our textbook. Actually, I've got the wrong page, I believe, listed on our notes. It is on page 864 in the newest edition of the textbook, where we're given an explication. You remember, explication means to explain and to analyze deeply, word for word, line for line. Now, if we had the time, we would write a paper about poetry. Obviously, we don't have the time. So you would be devoting the book of your final to poetry. I don't expect anything as developed or as well written as something that you would write in a paper that you would have 2 weeks to do. Again, for the final, I'm suggesting approximately 2 hours, even though you have a 24-hour period in which to submit it. So what I'm going to read to you now is not what I'm expecting. I wouldn't expect something this developed, the world we're in. But I wanted to give you an example of a piece of writing that has a good introduction, paragraphs. All of the paragraphs are developed so that there are 3 or more sentences each. The paragraphs have good topic sentences. A first sentence that basically summarizes what the paragraph is about. The example that we're given has 4 body paragraphs. I know that we're oftentimes taught a 5-paragraph essay, that 3 body paragraphs, an introduction, and a conclusion makes a paper. And that's the minimum of a paper. You can expand beyond that, and I certainly encourage you to do that at college by this point. So this person has used 4 body paragraphs. They could have used 40 or 400, but you're not necessarily required to write a book or a long paper in this instance. This takes up about 1.5 pages of our textbook, but it's single-spaced. If it were double-spaced, I suggest it would be approximately 3 pages, which would be pretty close to what we would be, let's say, examining in a paper for this class, a 4 or 5 page paper. And this example also has a great conclusion that doesn't add any new information but gives closure. So it reads like this. The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Notice you always give the name of the title and the author. In the example in the book, it just says this poem, but I'm going to supply this because that's the way you would write an essay. The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost intrigues readers because it is at once so simple and so deeply resonant. Recalling a walk in the woods, the speaker describes how he came to a fork in the road, which forced him to choose one path over another. Though, quote, sorry, unquote, that, quote, he could not travel both, unquote, he made a choice after carefully weighing his 2 options. This essentially is what happens in the poem. There is no other action. However, the incident is charged with symbolic significance by the speaker's reflections on the necessity and consequences of his decision. So that's our first paragraph. Our next paragraph, our first body paragraph, the final stanza. So note here that they've actually started to talk about the poem from the ending. You don't necessarily have to do it in chronological order. The final stanza indicates that the choice concerns more than simply walking down a road, For the speaker says that choosing the, quote, less traveled, unquote, path has affected his entire life. And, quote, that's made all the difference, unquote. Frost draws on a familiar enough metaphor when he compares life to a journey, but he's also calling attention to a less commonly noted problem. Despite our expectations, aspirations, appetites, hopes, and desires, we can't have it all. Making one choice precludes another. It's impossible to determine what particular decision the speaker refers to. Perhaps he had to choose a college, a career, a spouse. Perhaps he was confronted with mutually exclusive ideas, beliefs, or values. There's no way to know, because Frost wisely creates a symbolic choice and implicitly advises us to supply our own circumstances. Now, the next body paragraph reads, the speaker's reflections about his choice are essential to an understanding of the poem as a choice itself. Indeed, they may be more central. He describes the road taken as, quote, having perhaps the better claim, / because it was grassy and wanted wear, unquote. He prefers the, quote, less traveled path, unquote. This seems to be an expression of individualism, which would account for the, quote, difference, unquote, his choice made in his life. But Frost complicates matters by having the speaker also acknowledge there was no significant difference between the two roads. One was, quote, just as fair, unquote, as the other. Each was, quote, worn really about the same, unquote. And, quote, both that morning equally lay, / in leaves no step had trodden black, unquote. The speaker, and so that's the ending of that body paragraph. And notice how there are quotes. So there are pieces of evidence from the text to support what you're saying. And in the places where I read / in the quotes, that wasn't part of the original poem. A / with basically that slanted line was added in. And that's a piece of punctuation that we use to indicate a break in the line of poetry when we're writing about poetry. So this is the author of this paper basically is indicating when I said / that was the ending of one line and then the beginning of another. So the next body paragraph reads, the speaker imagines that in the future, quote, ages and ages hence, quote, he will recount his choice with, quote, a sigh, unquote, that will satisfactorily explain the course of his life. But Frost seems to be having a little fun here by showing us how the speaker will embellish his past decision to make it appear more dramatic. What we hear is someone trying to convince himself that the choice he made significantly changed his life. When he recalls what happened in, quote, the yellow wood, unquote, a color that gives a glow to the irretrievable moment when his life seemed to be on the verge of a momentous change, he appears more concerned with the path he did not choose than with the one he took. Frost shrewdly titles the poem to suggest the speaker's sense of loss and not being able to, quote, travel both, unquote, roads. When the speaker's reflections about his choice are examined, the poem reveals his nostalgia instead of affirming his decision to travel self-reliant path in life. So that's how that body paragraph ends. And I appreciate that they took a turn from the poem, Yellow Wood, and tried to explain what it might mean. A color that gives a glow to the irretrievable moment when his life seemed to be on the verge of a momentous change. I certainly can't disagree with that. I don't know if that's necessarily the answer or the only answer. I know that when I read Frost poetry, living in New England and knowing that Frost himself was a New Englander, I can't help but think of the seasons changing and the yellow in the trees, which would also be applicable. But yellow comes with lots of associations. Positive for sunshine, for instance, and happiness. Negative, for instance, for cowardice. And we could talk about all of that, I suppose, if we wanted to really dive deep into Yellow Wood. There's yet another body paragraph. So there are 4 body paragraphs here. This one reads, the rhyme stanzas of The Road Not Taken follow a pattern established in the first 5 lines. A, B, A, A, B. The rhyme scheme reflects, perhaps, the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. The natural speech rhythms Frost uses allow him to integrate the rhymes unobtrusively, but there is a slight shift in lines 19 and 20, when the speaker asserts self-consciously that the, quote, less traveled road, which we already know to be basically the same as the other road, made, quote, all the difference, unquote. Unlike all the other rhymes in the poem, difference does not rhyme precisely with hence. The emphasis must be placed on difference to make it rhyme precisely with hence, which may suggest the speaker is trying just a little too hard to pattern his life on his earlier choice in the woods. So that's the ending of the fourth body paragraph. I appreciate that the writer scanned the poem. They looked through the construction of the poem for the rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern and identified it. A, B, A, A, B. More importantly, they didn't stop there, but they talked about how that rhyme scheme could be important. And notice that they qualify their argument. The rhyme scheme reflects, perhaps, the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. Again, I can't necessarily disagree with that. And then we've got a concluding paragraph that gives closure. Perhaps the best way to begin reading Frost's poetry is to accept the invitation he placed at the beginning of many volumes of his poems. The pasture means what it says, of course. It's about taking care of some farm chores. But it's also a means of, quote, saying one thing in terms of another, unquote. The poem The Pasture is a simple but irresistible song-like invitation to the pleasures of looking at the world through the eyes of a poet. And that, too, is a great conclusion. You're not introducing new ideas. You're hinting at a related work by the same author, but you're not losing control of your paper, which is about not the related work, but the road not taken. And it is over 3 sentences long. I know in older versions of the text, that conclusion was only 2 sentences long. So they've obviously corrected that error in the newest version of the book, because we know that a paragraph should be 3 or more sentences. So I'm going to leave you to listen to Robert Frost read his poem, listen to a professional reader read his poem. And also, if you click on Because I Could Not Stop for Death, that particular link in the second section in the Poetry Foundation, you'll see one of those little red arrows that will ultimately lead you to a professional reader who reads Because I Could Not Stop for Death. So I encourage you to listen to all of these poems so that next class, which is our last class before the final, we will talk about 3 poems. Been a little bit heavy-handed with the 1900s because I've got a couple more poems from the 1900s. One entitled America by Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg being a beat poet. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in the 1950s. Very different kind of poetry that broke all kinds of boundaries. Very defiant, very unconventional. A poem by a local poet, Martina Spada, who teaches at UMass Amherst, actually, Coca-Cola and Coco Frio, and that was written in 1993. I'll always have some affection for that year. That was my first year at GCC teaching. And then finally, we will end with a poem from the 2000s, The Hill We Climb. And it comes with a very interesting story that we will talk about, where Amanda Gorman presented it at Joe Biden's presidential election. And she was the youngest poet to ever do so. It's a poem of hope. And seemed like a good way to end the semester. And when we get to Amanda Gorman, not only do we have the actual poets themselves reading their poetry, we've got them on video so we can see them perform their poetry. So with that said, I leave you to listen to the poems and answer the attendance question, which will be due Friday the 9th. Again, if you need a little bit of extra time, let me know. Out of all of the poems that we've studied thus far in class, which did you like the most? And why is really the more important piece. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.